Good morning, folks. I'd like to welcome everyone today and wish you all a good morning. My name is Arif Jetta, and I'm the Associate Scientific Director and Scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. I'm delighted to be moderating today's Institute for Work and Health speaker series. If this is your first time attending the IWH speaker series, welcome. And if you're a returning guest, we're really glad to have you back. Before I introduce our speaker today, there are a couple quick housekeeping items to be aware of. The first is that we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you do have any questions for the speaker, please type it into the Q&A function. We do have a large number of attendees today, and oftentimes we receive a lot of questions. If we don't get to your question, we invite you to email the speaker following the session, and the speaker will post their contact information that you can use. Closed captioning is available for the talk, so please use the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. A copy of this presentation will be sent to all attendees within a week of the speaker series, and it will be posted on the event page within a week as well. If you do run into any technical troubles, please leave us a note on the Q&A, and a member of our team will try to address it as quickly as possible. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Monique Gignac. Dr. Monique Gignac is Scientific Director and Senior Scientist at the Institute for Work and Health. She's also a professor at the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School of Public Health. Her research expertise is in the areas of health and social psychology, including health models of disability. A particular interest is research on workplace communication, privacy, support, and accommodation needs among individuals living with chronic episodic conditions. Dr. Gignac's presentation today is entitled Deciding Whether to Share Health Information at Work, a new evidence-based tool for workers with chronic conditions. In this presentation, Dr. Gignac's focus is going to focus on the challenges inherent in the decision-making process. She's going to outline how different workers prioritize information, how this relates to their disclosure decisions and work context. She also describes a new decision support tool called DCIDE that aims to help workers navigate the complexity of disclosure decisions. So with that, Dr. Gignac, over to you.
Thanks very much, Arif, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to share with you a new tool and some of the research that went into building the tool. I thought what I would do is start with some of my takeaway messages, so you'll know where I'm going. And they are that, first of all, many workers do not share health or support needs at work, and many of you may know that. Disclosure decisions can be complicated, complex. They will draw on health impacts, people's goals, their personal preferences, what support might be available to them, and perceptions of workplace supportiveness. And what's in addition to this amount of information that people will be trying to deal with, often some of this information simultaneously encourages and discourages sharing, which is very stressful for a lot of workers. So this tool that we've created is called DCIDE, and it stands for Disclosure Support for Communication of Invisible Disabilities that are Episodic, and I'll come back to some of these concepts later. And it helps workers consider whether to share personal information at work. The tool, we'll have links to it later in the presentation. It's freely available in English and French, and it also links to a number of other resources that can help with support and accommodation planning. So before I get started, I want to just acknowledge that this has been part of a large partnership grant. We call ourselves ACE, Accommodating and Communicating About Episodic Disabilities. And we've been working over the last several years to create a number of different tools and resources to help people. This particular tool, this presentation today, is a subset of a larger group of individuals who were involved as part of ACE. I want to particularly acknowledge our expert advisory committee who have helped us in so many ways. These are people with lived experience who have really helped build the tool. And they are Alexander Ewing, Amanda Fraser, Catherine Hofstetter, Haley Pitcher, and Graham Reed. We've also had a large number of researchers and people with a variety of different skills who've helped build the tool. The funding has come from grants, primarily from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. But we've also had a large number of partners, particularly health charities who have worked with us in a variety of different capacities over the last several years to kind of help their communities and build these resources with us. We also received some funds from Employment and Social Development Canada to help with some of the knowledge translation and exchange. So what I'd like to do in the presentation is start with a little bit of setting the stage and talk about disability in Canada, then go into some of the research that shows us why disclosure decisions can be so difficult, tell you a little bit about the DCIDE tool, and then come back to those takeaway messages with some next steps. In terms of disability, I want to just note that this is a term that is changing in its meaning or has changed. But I think some important points for us today are that by virtue of living with a chronic or an episodic condition doesn't guarantee a disability. When we talk about a disability, we're often thinking about a limitation in performing activity that arises both because of the health condition, but also because of personal environmental factors. And that can include negative attitudes or the demands of the activity. It can come about because of public policies and practices, physical environments, and limited social support. And why that's important to remember that it's this interaction is it means that we can change the limitations that a person experiences sometimes. And it's important to keep that in mind when we think about work activities and work practices, that they can often be altered to help minimize or ameliorate a disability. In Canada, as of 2023, Statistics Canada tells us there are about 8 million Canadians who report living with a disability. Most of these individuals say that their limitations are not constant. About 39% of people say that the limitations are fairly stable, fairly constant. Most of individuals, 61%, say that their disability changes or their limitations change, and that can be related to health or environmental conditions. We have about 23% of people who say they have periods of time with few limitations, but over time a condition might be getting worse. About 13% of Canadians will say it fluctuates a lot. And about 25% will say that they have periods of a month or more with no limitations, sometimes years with no limitations, and then they may have episodes or flares. So I've put on this slide a number of examples of common mental health conditions, a number of physical conditions that are often considered episodic disabilities. Workplace support matters when thinking about these conditions because employment rates in Canada for people with disabilities are about 20% lower than people without a disability. And people with disabilities are more likely to be employed in precarious and lower quality jobs with less access to workplace supports. And so one of the goals, of course, is to try to decrease this gap. Can we get more people with disabilities working in the jobs that make use of their skills and their talents? Now, recognizing that a disability can be episodic and changing can come with then some challenges in terms of providing support because things are sometimes unpredictable and changing. They also create a number of issues around workplace disability communication and disclosure and privacy protection. And so that's what I'd like to talk a little bit more about today. And I'd like to note that in Canada, across several Canadian surveys, just to give you a sense of whether people share information, anywhere from about a quarter to nearly half of participants in several Canadian surveys will say they have not shared any information about their limitations at work with their supervisor. So why are these decisions so difficult? Well, there's lots of reasons. They include the mechanics or the practicalities of disclosure, that you don't know for sure what the outcome is going to be. And there's a lot to consider. So when it comes to the mechanics of disclosure, the practicalities, people will have to consider not only whether to share information, but with whom to share, what to say, how much, Do you do this face-to-face or online? So the mode of sharing. And this is usually not a one-time decision. People will say, you know, their health can change, their job changes, the people they work with change. And so it's often multiple decisions that people have to make over time. There's a lot of uncertainty around the outcome, and that creates risk, that creates stress. So there is a fair bit of research here. It looks at what people's concerns are, and they'll include things like loss of reputation or worries about career advancement, stigma, gossip come up, that nothing can be done. People are concerned if they'll lose their job if they share. They're concerned they'll lose their job if they don't share. And the research that's out here really finds different outcomes. So there's no one right decision, and that does make it stressful. But it speaks to, well, what should people be thinking about? What are they considering in making decisions? Different types of information. Do people prioritize some information over other types? And are there patterns? Can we kind of look at all this complexity and discern how people are making decisions to help support them in a choice that might be right for them? So that's what we were aiming to do in building a communication decision support tool. We wanted to help people think about different aspects of a decision so that they could feel more comfortable that they were making a decision that was right for them. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about how we built the tool. Want to talk about how did a sample of workers with different physical and mental health conditions respond to the tool questions. Talk about whether the tool was able to differentiate among people with different needs and preferences and experiences. And ultimately, can the tool perhaps help address some of the complexity around making a decision? So what we've been doing over the last several years is we've reviewed a lot of the existing research, and that includes published studies, but we also did a lot of work to look at the gray literature and see what was out there already on publicly available websites. We've held ongoing consultations with individuals who have lived experience, and we've reached out to a lot of partners and other stakeholders for their input and guidance. Essentially, what the tool does is it asks about 5 different decision dimensions. And these are the dimensions that we hear about most often in studies and when we talk to others. So there are questions about what the health impacts are and the needs of a person. There are questions about a person's goals, their communication preferences, what's available in their workplace in terms of support, and perceptions of the workplace culture in terms of its supportiveness. And I'll run through each of these in just a moment. What we did is we gave a big survey to nearly 600 individuals so that we could test these items. And we reviewed the properties of the tool. We tried to reduce the tool, the number of items, and we did some initial validity work on the tool. And we also try to, again, examine these naturally occurring groups or clusters of people so we could see how people might differ in terms of their decisions and the stress they felt and work context. So does the tool seem to be meaningful, in other words? Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit quickly about the 5 dimensions. We asked a number of questions, and I've got some examples on the slides. All the slides, as RF said, will be made available to you if you're interested in them. But we asked a number of questions about health impacts and needs, whether your health was impacting work, your work was impacting your health, changes, whether people had a need for support, whether they were being performance monitored or had been advised not to do some activities, and health and safety concerns. We also asked about goals. Now, goals are sometimes in the literature divided into approach and avoidance goals. So approach goals are usually things we do to try to pursue something good. And so or something that will help us, help the situation work out well for us. So you may want to get some accommodations or advice to help you to be able to work better. So if you have approach goals, they would typically encourage sharing. But we also do things to avoid a problem, to avoid punishments. And those kinds of goals might discourage sharing. So we might want to protect our reputation or career advancement and protect the job, our finances. So we looked at different types of goals. It's also important to look at a person's personal preferences. Some people like to share, some people want to keep information private. So we asked a number of questions, and they were in the form of a statement, and you could say whether you disagreed or agreed with the statement on a scale. And essentially, there were two dimensions that fell out here. So you could have positive perceptions and see benefits to disclosing. You know, I want to be open and honest with my colleagues. Sharing information about my health can help me cope better with the pressures of work. But you could also have negative perceptions. I value my privacy and I don't want to share information. So I'm going to say that a different way. You could have people say that they had mostly positive perceptions and they disagreed with the negative, or people could have mostly negative perceptions and disagree with the positive. But of course, the world's complicated. People can agree with both. So people could have both positive perceptions and negative perceptions. And people can be apathetic. I don't really see anything positive about sharing, but I also don't really have any negative perceptions. So I'm saying this to just already show you that you can have these different perceptions that push and pull you in different directions. Also, of course, important to understanding whether you're going to say anything is, have you got something available to you to do something about it? So we asked a number of questions about the availability of support in a workplace rather, in terms of access to benefits or HR, paid sick days, and so on. And finally, we asked about perceptions of the workplace. And here again, we had questions that were more positive about the workplace culture, questions that were more negative, and people could have a variety of responses to these. So I'm concerned there's too much gossip in my workplace. I would be comfortable sharing some information about my health condition because my workplace support and accommodation policies are fair to employees. So we had a range of questions here. So that's the 5 dimensions. Already you can see it's pretty complicated, but that's what we know people are using to make decisions. So what did we hear from the nearly 600 people who were in the study? So first of all, just briefly tell you, we had a fair bit of variability in the sample, which is good, which is something that we want. There's a lot of information on this slide. I won't go through all of it, but we had a range of women and men, and 1% of the sample identified as non-binary. The age range of our participants were 21 to 75 years. We had a range of types of conditions, with 35% of our sample, in this case, reporting both physical and mental health conditions. Most people, 3/4 of our participants, had what we would consider an episodic or dynamic disability. It wasn't continuous. It changed, with 44% of people saying it was recurrent. So they had long periods of time sometimes where they had no limitations. We had a range of different sectors, although not as many people in sales and service or constructions, utilities, manufacturing as broad groups. Most participants worked full-time. We had a range of organization sizes. Over half were in very large organizations of over 500 people, but we had more than 1/4 who were working in organizations with fewer than 100 individuals. And about 43% of our participants belonged either to a union or some kind of professional association that represented them. In terms of what we heard around disclosure, we had about 58% of participants say that they had disclosed to a supervisor, which means about 42% haven't, and that's in keeping with other studies. More people were likely to disclose to a colleague, but still about 1/4 of our participants had not said anything to colleagues. People were less likely to disclose to someone like in HR or a union representative. Other research we and others have done suggests often when these individuals are involved, something is not going well. There are more significant issues in the workplace that are making it difficult for someone to work. And regardless of whether someone disclosed or not, 65% of participants said they experienced pressure in making a decision. When we now look at some of those dimensions, what do we start to see? In terms of impact and a need for support, health is impacting the job. We had about half the sample say they had little or no impact or some impact. So something was going on, but not a lot at work. About 29% of people said they had a considerable impact, and 1 in 5, 20% said they had an extreme impact. And by extreme here, we're talking about people who said there were work and safety issues, or health and safety issues rather. They could not do some parts of their job without support. They had been told they should not do some parts of their job, or they were being performance monitored. They had answered that there was a lot going on. So that's the extreme impact group. When we looked at workplace support availability, what we see here is that actually 78% of the sample had many supports available. They did have access to benefits, HR, other things. So that was good news in this particular sample. It's not true for everyone, of course. About 16% had some availability and 5% had low availability. So if you just look at these two dimensions, there seems to be a foundation here where support is possible and might be useful, because we have about half of our participants who really could use some support, and over 3/4 say support is available in their workplace. And typically that's been what's been focused on only. So what do we see when we start looking at these other dimensions that we know are important? Now the picture starts to get even more complicated than it already is. We had only 13% of people in the study said that most of their goals were approach goals that would encourage them to disclose. About 29% of people had, in fact, mostly avoidance goals. They did not want to be sharing, or sharing would be discouraged in terms of meeting their goals. Over 1/3 of people actually had both a lot of approach goals and a lot of avoidance goals, which would really create a situation of uncertainty. And interestingly, 1/4 of people had really no goals in mind. And we need to sort of find out more about that. The two explanations that, if I were to draw on other research to explain it, would be a good chunk of these people probably don't have much in the way of a problem or impact, so why be thinking about goals? You don't really need anything done. But we also, the more unfortunate situation is a number of people will talk about a crisis, and that's what made their decision for them. And so they really had no time to be thinking about goals. When we look at preferences and people's perceptions of support, we see quite a bit of a mix. We have, in terms of personal preferences, about 11% of people said, I don't have any positive preferences or negative preferences. I'm really uninterested, kind of apathetic. We have about 1/3 of people who were interested in disclosing, but 37% reluctant. And then we've got this group again, where they can see the positive aspects of disclosing, they can see the negative, and they're really being torn by it. In terms of perceptions of the workplace, we have 58% of our participants said their workplace was supportive, which was good news. But 1 in 5, 20%, didn't see their workplace supportive. A lot of uncertainty, in the sense of 16% of people were uncertain. And then again, we've got this kind of apathetic group of really just don't care, about 6%. So that's a lot. If you're already confused, this is the kind of thing that people who are making decisions often go through. So how do we make sense of it all? Again, are there some naturally occurring groups? By looking at this information, we can get insights into how people are likely to use the tool, and it can inform the kind of feedback we give people, because feedback is really important. There are some tools that exist, and typically, many of them don't provide much in the way of the feedback to help you distill the information. And so that can then create just additional stress. So we did something called cluster analysis, and I won't go into the details about it, but it's a statistical technique that helps identify distinct groupings of people that are similar based on a set of variables. And so in this case, those variables are those 5 decision dimensions that I talked about earlier. We would expect, if the groups are meaningful, that they would differ in some of those decision dimensions. And so we could see ways of characterizing them that are quite unique. We would also expect, if they're meaningful, that they might differ in terms of their decisions, in terms of the stress they experience, and possibly in terms of work characteristics. So when we did the cluster analysis, we found 6 different groupings. And I'm going to give you a bit of a hint of some of what we're going to see to help distill the findings. Despite the fact that a lot of people had needs and had an impact of their health, and despite the fact that many people had support available, most of the groups were characterized in terms of the emphasis they were putting on their subjective perceptions. So this is another one of those busy slides. I would say here, this is actually the 6 groups, but I've combined 2 of the groups that were very small into one column on the right. I'll go over this. The 6 groups, although there's a lot of information here, if you're interested in the slides, are really characterized by the label that we've given them, and that will help you to kind of keep them in mind. So we had one group where essentially all is generally well. And this was nearly half the sample. And what was sort of unique about these folks is that you had about 2/3 of them really didn't have a big impact of their health on work. They might have had some impact. 96% of them had a very positive culture, perceptions of their culture at work, and all of them had many supports available. So again, this is important because not everybody with a disability is struggling. So this is the all is generally well group. The second group was nearly 1/4 of the sample, and this group needs help but is reluctant to disclose. So that's their label. Now you see over 2/3 have a considerable or extreme impact. Over half the sample, or about half the sample, had mostly avoidance goals. All of them were reluctant to disclose. That was their personal preference. 58% had a negative workplace culture, although over 3/4 had many supports available, but they were reluctant to disclose. Third group, a little similar, but a little different, need help, but this group was uncertain about disclosing. So now we've got 12% of the sample. Even more, a greater percentage of this group had people with considerable or extreme impacts and needs. So there was a lot of struggling with the impact on work. Nearly 70%, though, have both approach and avoidance goals. 85% have both positive and negative personal preferences that's making them uncertain about disclosing. And 63% also have positive and negative feelings about the culture that's making them uncertain whether this is really a supportive culture. But here again, 3/4 have many supports available. And then just in these last couple of groups, they were smaller. The feel supported but had few options group was interesting to us. Here you had a mix of impact and needs, but half of the respondents here were willing to disclose. All of them said the culture was very positive, but none of them, 100% of them, had few supports available. So we're interested in who these folks are. And then we had a couple of groups rather, who really didn't have a lot of impact. They really didn't have much in the way, they had few goals or some avoidance goals, and were really just kind of uninterested in sharing or the culture. And so it really just wasn't a big deal for them. So the groups, as you can see, seem to be meaningful in terms of differentiating where, how people are responding to some of those dimensions around decisions. Can we see other differences between them that would suggest they're also meaningful? So what we did is we looked at disclosure. And as we would expect, the group that was reluctant to disclose was less likely to have members who had disclosed. So only 33% of people in this group had disclosed to a supervisor. Remember, they do have considerable need, so that may explain why some people are disclosing, but many people haven't. When you look at the all is generally well and the uncertain about disclosing groups, you have just over 2/3 of people in both these groups have disclosed to a supervisor, but they're quite different in other respects. So the uncertain about disclosing group has significantly more stress, feels more pressure in making a decision, is having significantly more problems at work with their productivity and meeting their job demands, and has a considerably more worries about their job than the all is generally well group. That first group, the all is generally well, was also significantly different to the reluctant to disclose group in terms of stress and pressure and other things. Not much differences with those remaining three groups. If we try to understand a little bit about work context, just a couple of things to note here. The group that was the youngest was that group of people who were in the field supported but few options. They were also more likely to be part-time workers working in sales and service and smaller organizations. So that seems to explain why they may feel that they work with a great group of people, but they don't have a lot of formal policies and practices in place. In terms of the other groups, education didn't differ amongst some of the three bigger groups. What was a difference was the type of condition. So the group that was uncertain about disclosing had more mental health and people who had both mental health and physical health conditions. So they had more often impacts, and we saw that in the previous slide. The need help but reluctance actually had quite a mix of conditions, but the all is generally well tended to have more physical conditions than some of the other groups. So that's a little bit about the groups. You may be sort of trying to figure out where you would fall if you were to fill out questions like this. I think that, some of the bottom lines, we have a lot of people who are positive about sharing, but others who aren't willing or uncertain about disclosing despite needs. As I mentioned, those subjective perceptions are often guiding decisions. So a tool we think can really help here by doing a number of different things. It can help identify, again, what the important decision elements are. And we know sometimes these get ignored. We hear from our expert advisors, people tend to focus sometimes on one or the other aspect, and they haven't thought through all of the different dimensions. So by helping people to think about these different dimensions, we can help balance decision making. We can also then start helping to organize and summarize all of this information for people by creating a tool that is interactive, and we can point to some additional resources. So we're winding up here. I want to just tell you then a little bit more about the tool. So our goals when we created DCIDE really were to be adopting a prevention and support framework. We'd love to help people be more proactive, less crisis focused. You can see why it's important to not just give people endless lists of things to think about. A tool that's personalized and interactive, accessible, evidence-based is really important here. We wanted the tool to be relevant to different conditions, types of jobs, personal preferences, wanted to be able to give feedback and then link to other resources to help people. So overall, we could help improve the disclosure decision process. And privacy is extremely important. As you saw, many people aren't willing to share information. So what can you do and how can we protect privacy? The way the tool works, and there is a link there, and I think we'll have it in the chat as well. I encourage you to try the tool. You would go into the tool, you would select whether you want an English or a French version of the tool, read through the introduction, which just guides you through how the tool works and how we think it helps, what it isn't. It isn't legal advice, it isn't medical advice. And then you would work through the 5 different dimensions. And most of the questions are yes, no, I don't know, or there are these disagree, agree kinds of statements. For every one of those 5 dimensions that I've been talking about, the programming of the tool is going to place you in a category that reflects your responses. And it's going to be similar to what you saw earlier. So if you answered the questions about your culture, you might be told that mostly you see your culture as supportive, or depending on your answers, as not supportive, or you're really uncertain and torn in how you view things and so on. So each of the dimensions, you will get a summary like that. And so there'll be something at the bottom to have you reflect before you go on to the next section about what your situation is, and then some things to think about. And the things to think about are really to help you think about some of the benefits and the drawbacks of sort of where you are right now, that, you know, that might work for you, but you should also be thinking about some of these other things. When you're finished the tool, you can save a PDF of everything. We do not use your data. We don't save anything. We don't ask you for anything that's private. You can save a version and come back to it later, but after about 72 hours, everything is deleted. The report that you get summarizes all of your answers in terms of the different categories that you seem to fit into. And then it provides you with some next steps, things to think about, and access to the job demands and accommodation planning tool and some other resources. So the next steps material is really, if you don't think sharing is right for you right now, well, what can you do? What should you think about? If you do think you're ready for sharing, now we'll give you some of that practical information to think about, who to think about speaking with, how much do you want to share? And so we go through some different information and talk about advantages and disadvantages, so you can kind of decide on what approach might be best for you. It's also important to think about, well, what are the problems you're having with your job? Are there supports that you could be using and thinking about? And are there supports you can use even if you don't want to share? So we give links to the other tool that we developed, and I've presented on this in the past on behalf of the group, which is the Job Demands and Accommodation Planning tool. It's also freely available. The only thing I'll note with this tool is that there are versions for this tool for the worker, but there are also versions for the organization. So if you are a supervisor or a clinician, there are versions for you to fill out as well. So that was a lot. Just to wrap up with my takeaway messages again, as I mentioned, many workers don't share health or support needs at work. So we do need additional efforts here to improve workplace support provision. As you can see, availability of supports is not sufficient for workers to be seeking support. Talked a lot about how this is complex and why this is complex. You can see how workers are prioritizing information differently, and that this can be related to work context. So we do want to do more research to identify modifiable factors related to support provision. And we need to be able to better understand the subjective perceptions are very important. I would not discount them in the least. But is this the best balance for making a decision? We've been able to identify some initial validity for the tool. It does seem to be meaningful. It seems to be able to discriminate among individuals. And so we want to do more research, of course, to look at the tool outcomes. So just to summarize, the website provides you with the DCIDE tool, provides you with the JDAPT. There are also some information on the website that defines key concepts, if you're not familiar with some of them, and further information on different employment and accommodation rights in Canada. The tools are free, they're confidential, they're available in English and French, and I hope you'll check them out and let us know what you think. And I will stop there to see if people have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monique. That was a terrific presentation, and we're getting a number of questions in the Q&A. I just wanted to remind folks just before we get into the Q&A that presentation materials will be sent to you within the next week and will also be posted on the event page, so just stay tuned for that. We are going to be using the Q&A function, so if you do have a question, please type it in. We have a large number of attendees, so there's a chance that we might not be able to ask all of the questions that we receive, but we do invite you to send Dr. Gignac an email, and you can ask those questions directly just in case we're not able to get to your question. So, Monique, the first question kind of expands on some of your later slides, and you note that the DCIDE tool is aimed at workers making a decision about disclosing. And so maybe you could elaborate on whether your research suggests messages for employers or those who provide support for workers about disclosing and support at work. And to what extent might these be tailored to different levels of kind of supervisors, senior managers, or other kind of individuals within the workplace?
Okay, thank you. I think there are a number of messages for different groups in a workplace. So thinking about some of those folks in general, I would say I think there are probably at least three big messages that would be relevant to a number of groups. The first would be that I think you can see from the data, many individuals have few support needs, and workplaces are doing a good job in providing the support that they do need, and people are recognizing that in their perceptions. So there tends to be sometimes a tendency to think that, oh, this is going to be difficult, it's going to be complex and expensive if I have people with disabilities in my organization. We're not seeing that for many individuals. So that's a message, I think, for people who are hiring, for people who are supervising others, or providing support. This message, again, that even if the support is available, that may not be enough to really close that gap in support provision. I think that's another really important message for leaders, for supervisors and others, that we need to be thinking about some of these other workplace factors. And I think some of the big factors in a workplace, which would be the third thing to think about, are the culture challenges. And in particular, it's not just enough to have people think, I work with a nice group of people. We had a lot of people who thought they worked with a nice group of people, but at the same time still had some negative perceptions. So I would actually encourage people who are providing support to others to work through the tools, to see the specific questions that we ask, and think more about, would my workplace actually come across positively in this way or that way, or if people had this goal, would we be able to meet them? So that's sort of a little bit, I think, to answer your question, Dr. Jetta.
Thank you so much. So again, a lot of really positive comments regarding your presentation. There are some questions related to the kind of the definition of disability and episodic disability that you took when you conducted this research, and some people are maybe asking you to expand on like kind of what groups were captured within your kind of population, and some folks on the chat asked, like, could this be applicable to groups including those who are facing menopause or those who are facing alcohol or substance abuse disorders? Like, can we expand this beyond the population that you have studied, and maybe what's the utility for other groups who are experiencing kind of episodic challenges?
Right. And it's a good question. Thank you. So in terms of who we included, first of all, in the study, so we did have people with constant and episodic. We had mental health. We did have some substance use issues. We had a number of people with neurodiverse conditions, ADHD. We had a range of mental health, PTSD, so more serious, as well as more common mental health conditions. Quite a range of physical health conditions, some that were progressive and over time. So we had, MS, inflammatory bowel disease. So we had quite a range of conditions. We are finding with our other resource, the JDAP, the Job Demands and Accommodation Planning Tool, we're hearing from some people that does have wide applicability. Would this tool be useful for someone, for example, with menopause to fill out, a pregnant woman to fill out, substance use? I would say we want to do more testing. I think where the questions might not work as well might be those impact need questions sometimes, because they really are geared more toward health conditions. But I do think there would be components of the tool that would be helpful to start thinking about how you feel about your organization, what your goals are for disclosing. And I think as we go forward, we would very much like to do some more research with other types of situations, experiences that people have that are not necessarily a chronic health condition.
Got it. So I just to kind of reiterate some of the comments that are being made in the Q&A, that there seems to be your presentation has resonated with those who might not have traditionally been captured within your sample, but so I think there's some opportunities down the line for you to engage with these folks. So again, we would encourage you to kind of reach out to Dr. Gignac and maybe talk more about how maybe the groups that you work with might find this tool helpful. So we're getting some questions about how to introduce this tool within a workplace. And in particular, do you have any recommendations on how a workplace can bring this to their employees who might need support? Like what might be some practical steps they take to implement this?
Yeah, thank you. And I thought a little bit about this. It's a tough question because you don't know what you don't know. So you don't know how many people are perhaps not sharing and would like to share. So I guess one suggestion might be to bring some of these kinds of tools forward as part of general wellness initiatives, that people often have experiences or situations that make it difficult for them to know whether they want to share information, to get support. We do want to be supportive. So if you're thinking about this, here are some resources that you could maybe use to kind of start thinking about it. So, that might be one way to approach this. I think, obviously there are many larger organizations that will have disability specific offices or supports available. One of the challenges we found in creating some of our tools was that so many people did not see themselves as a person with a disability. So if you just say this is coming from the disability office or the group that to address this issue, you will actually miss a lot of people who may say, I live with a health condition, but I'm not a person with a disability. So that term disability has a lot of meanings. I personally would be, think it's great if it gets, the tools are promoted as part of that, but I think I would try to go beyond that in trying to generate interest in these kinds of resources and just talk about wellness in general for people to start thinking about them.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that. Okay, so we have another kind of a couple people have asked this question about the socioeconomic status of some of the participants in your study. And in particular, I think some of the questions are like, to what extent is this tool relevant for maybe individuals who are working in low-paying, precarious types of jobs, maybe those who are kind of working poor. And so maybe you could talk about the applicability of the DCIDE tool to workers across the spectrum of kind of low-wage workers to middle-wage and high-wage workers.
Yeah, so it's a question that needs more research. So first of all, we did try to get quite a spectrum in the sample, and we can always do better, and we'd like to do more. But you saw that one group of people who actually said they had very little available to them, who often had shared because they were working with good people. They felt that they were working with supportive people. And that was interesting to us. Now, you can have a situation, of course, where you're not working with people who you think are supportive and you don't have a lot available to you. And so this is where I would really emphasize the whole efforts that we've been making as part of this ACE partnership grant. The DCIDE tool is really not meant to be a standalone tool. It's meant to go hand in hand with those other resources. Because I think that's where you would, if you're working in different types of jobs, you would really be able to, for example, now think more about who you might be able to trust, what you might be able to say, but also what are my needs? And that's where that job demands and accommodation planning tool would come in. And that tool, we have seen it being useful to people in gig work and in all kinds of different jobs. Where we've been able to do testing so far. Obviously, as a researcher, I have to always say more testing, more testing. But I think that that's what I would be encouraging people to do, is think of them as a pair of tools. Understand why you're making the decision you're making. Is it something about your workplace, or is it something about you being reluctant to say something? And then move into, well, what can you do regardless of how you're feeling right now?
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. And just to also remind folks, we would invite you to come to the website and look at some of these tools in greater depth, and maybe take them for a spin and explore their utility. So the website is here on the slide.
And let us know.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mean, there's an email. We don't, because we're not collecting the information, or not saving the information. It's yours. But we're happy to get feedback from people about ways the tool's working or not working well.
Great. Thank you for that. We have a couple questions about the context of where the study was conducted. So obviously, Monique, you're based in Toronto, Canada, and so some of the questions that are being posed are: is this a Canadian only tool? Is this a local Ontario focused tool? Can this be used in other countries, low, middle income? Yeah, like to what extent can we use this elsewhere?
Um, it's It is not an Ontario-only tool. I will say the tool was developed with people from different parts of the country, and the survey was actually done across Canada, and the survey was available in English and French. So certainly the initial work building the tool has been largely Canada. We do have some US members on the team. And so we think it's relevant I would think it's relevant to some other countries, but here is where I would have some caveats. Legislation is different in different countries related to disclosure and accommodations. And so we have used the legislation around privacy and duty to accommodate, and some of that is Canadian. US legislation in the UK, Australia can be similar, but it's not entirely the same. It's not the same in Scandinavia, although I think there's a lot of value that the tool would have. But there would be, I think, differences in some of the availability of supports and mostly what we tell you about next steps that could vary by country. And the other thing I will say now, in case it does come up, it's not a tool, none of the tools are really fit for duty tools. They're not meant to be used to decide whether or not someone is able to do this job. In the sense of there are sometimes certain professions, if you're a first responder, where you have to be able to do a certain kinds of things to do that job. So there are much more specific tools for certain occupations, but this is a really good beginning point for people as they start thinking about support and support provision, I think, across a really wide range of occupations and tools. We haven't had the DCIDE tool being up long enough to know whether or not it's relevant to others. We have had the JDAP, the Job Demands and Accommodation Planning tool. We've had thousands of people from other countries at this point. That tool's been around for a year and a half, who have said that they have used the tool. And so it seems like it does have some applicability, that tool, to other scenarios, but it's available in English and French.
Great, thank you for expanding on that. So we have time for a few more questions, and so I'm gonna kind of throw them your way, Monique. So the first question is about the role of unions. One participant highlighted that unions play a significant role in the decision to disclose and can often support a worker. And so to what extent might this tool be relevant for the decision to disclose to a union representative, and how might that kind of relate to this ongoing relationship within the work environment between a worker, a union representative, and the employer?
Yeah, thank you. I do think, I absolutely agree. I think unions are critical. And from what we've heard in some of our other research, the role of unions is taking on more and more of a supportive role of workers with specific health conditions. One of the challenges we've heard from workers in the past is that they have told us, well, I would go to my union if I had a grievance against my supervisor or something like that, but I would not go to them if I had a health condition, because I think I would be perceived as someone who's asking for special treatment or favoritism. And so the extent to which that is correct or incorrect is something that I think unions need to be aware of, because there may be some image issues that need to be addressed. And the tool can maybe help with some of that, why people are reluctant. You saw in an earlier slide that only 27% of people in the study had actually disclosed to someone like HR or union representative. Same thing for HR, by the way. A lot of workers see HR as working for the company, the organization, not for them. So I think some of these groups, in seeing how few people are disclosing to you, it might be helpful to better understand why. And it may be I don't need any of your help right now.
Yeah,
But I think there are other things going on with what the perception is of those groups in terms of providing support.
great. So I think one last question to kind of wrap up today's speaker series is about next steps. A bunch of folks on the Q&A are asking, like, what's next? Do you have any other tools or resources that are kind of coming from this? Are there additional research studies that you plan to pursue given the findings from this research? Maybe you can just outline where you're going with all of this research.
I'd love to do more in terms of, I think, in terms of some of the clear next steps, it would be to kind of continue to get evaluation of the tools, and I think to refine some of the tools. So we have, I didn't mention it, but we've had a lot of different occupations. I mean, there was the broad sectors, but we've had teachers and healthcare workers, and we've had truck drivers and lots of different people. But, you know, to kind of tailor some of these tools more specifically to some groups would be terrific. So if you represent some of these groups and you would like to do some of this research with us, please do let us know. I think we'd like to enhance on the resources that we can kind of give people as well, so that we can target a broader range of solutions to help people when they have differing kinds of issues. And there's always, again, you know, someone mentioned about lower income or lower education or certain kinds of jobs. I think there's more work there to be done. You know, we've tried to make something really broad that I think is useful as a first step, but enhancing its usability for different groups to make it more inclusive and accessible would be terrific. So for example, one of the tools, a completely different group has been looking at it in terms of early onset dementia. And, you know, what are the specific needs for this group, and you know, doing some evaluation work there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gignac, for his wonderful presentation. We're getting lots of positive comments in the Q&A, and so thank you to everyone for attending today's speaker series. Just a quick FYI, our next speaker series that will be available to all will be held on January 28th, 2025, so in the new year, and the talk will be delivered by Dr. Kathleen Dobson. So more information will be circulated, and we hope that you'll be able to attend this next speaker series. So again, thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you
Thank you.